She had just turned 18 when her father made the announcement. His voice firm and cold, as though the matter was already sealed by fate. "You'll marry him," he said, not as a suggestion but as a decree. The man in question was a rancher, older, rugged, already a widower, with 2 small children, clinging to his boots like shadows of his late wife. The town whispered when the marriage was arranged, some calling it duty, others calling it cruelty, and many shaking their heads in pity for the young girl who still had the innocence of youth painted across her face. She had dreamed of love, of a boy who would come with flowers in his hand and laughter in his voice, not a man hardened by land, labor, and loss. Yet her father saw the marriage as security, land, cattle, and a name that carried weight in a small, judgmental town. On her wedding day, she wore a dress too big for her hands trembling as though even the lace weighed heavily on her shoulders. The rancher was respectful, but his eyes carried the heaviness of grief, and he offered her no smile, only a nod that told her she was stepping into a life, not of her choosing but of her father's making. The days that followed were harder than she had ever imagined. The ranch was vast, the work endless, and the silence between her and her husband deafening. She was little more than a stranger in her own home, surrounded by wooden walls that echoed loneliness. The 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, looked at her with suspicion, as if she were trying to replace the mother they had lost. They avoided her at first, whispering to each other when they thought she couldn't hear, crying softly at night for the woman who had held them. She tried to reach them with gentle words. With food she cooked carefully. With songs she sang quietly, but they turned away. And every evening when the rancher came home, covered in dust and shadows, he would eat quietly, barely speaking, his grief like an unspoken wall between them. The town wagged their tongues, saying it was only a matter of time before the girl ran back to her father, begging for escape. Some said she'd never manage the ranch, never soften the children, never survive the weight of being a wife when she was barely a woman herself. But life has a way of testing the heart until it grows, stronger than it ever thought possible. One evening, as the wind howled against the windows and the fire flickered weakly, the little girl, trembling and feverish, fell ill. The rancher was away tending to the cattle, and the boy panicked, tears streaming down his face. Without hesitation, she lifted the small child into her arms, her fear drowned out by a sudden courage that came from love she didn't even know she had. Through the night, she cared for her, wiping her brow, whispering promises that she wouldn't let her go, that she would fight the sickness with all her strength. When the rancher returned at dawn and found his daughter breathing steadily, her head resting on the young bride's shoulder, something broke inside him. A wall, a chain of grief, a silence that had held him captive. For the first time, he looked at the girl not as a duty bound to him by her father, but as a woman who had given selflessly without being asked. From then on, the children began to soften. The boy followed her in the kitchen, watching curiously, sometimes helping with clumsy hands. The little girl began to cling to her skirts, asking for stories, pressing her small face into her side for comfort. The rancher, still quiet, began to share moments of unexpected kindness. He showed her how to ride the horses, how to mend fences, how to understand the land that stretched endlessly before them. The 2 of them began to work side by side, not as strangers but as partners. She discovered his laughter, rare and low, like thunder after a long drought. And the children began to laugh too, the house filling with a warmth it had not known for years. The town, always eager for gossip, now had new stories to tell. They had expected her to fail, to falter, to abandon the ranch in tears. Instead, they watched in awe as the young bride breathed life into a broken home. They saw her ride through town with the children smiling beside her, the rancher tipping his hat proudly as if to say the family was whole again. Women whispered to each other in the market, marveling at how courage had bloomed from innocence, how strength had risen from a girl who had once been forced into a marriage. Against her will, men shook their heads, humbled, admitting quietly that the girl had turned into a woman stronger than most. But the most shocking moment came one Sunday morning when the rancher, who had long avoided the town's gatherings, walked hand in hand with his young wife and his children into the small church. The people stared as he held her hand tightly, openly, proudly, as though she were the best choice he had ever made. It was not the girl her father had forced into marriage who walked beside him that day, but a woman who had claimed her place, who had built love from sorrow, and who had transformed grief into hope. The town never looked at her the same again. Her father, watching silently from the back pew, bowed his head in shame. He had thought he was condemning her to a loveless fate, but instead he had unknowingly set her on the path to a life richer and fuller than she could have imagined. And though she forgave him, she also knew the truth, that love is not something a man can force upon a woman, but something she can create even in the harshest soil, if her heart is strong enough to endure. And so, what began as a forced marriage became the very story that shocked the town, not because of tragedy but because of triumph. A young bride had turned a house of sorrow into a home of laughter, a grieving man into a loving husband, and two lost children into a family.